Hello and welcome to Fail Forward, a series of videos all about the bits of games which don't quite work and why. This episode is supposedly about Dark Souls 2, From Software's dark fantasy sequel, in which the nameless undead player fights his or her way across a fallen empire in the hopes of breaking the cyclical curse which has corrupted the land and destroyed countless empires before it too. And with its talk of endless cycles, its overt patterning with repeated motifs and motifs of repetition, it is very much a game about being a sequel. But as neat a framing device as that is, in some ways there's not much of a consolation when you're a sequel to one of the greatest and most literate games of all time, Dark Souls. And really, this episode is probably as much about that game, if not more so, since its sequel's flaws are interesting precisely because they illuminate the genius of the original. And forewarning here, I will spoil a great deal about both. Whatever From Software did, and however much they acknowledged it, Dark Souls 2 was always going to be an exercise in bottling lightning. Dark Souls is a game of bleak, cruel brilliance, creating a world that is staggeringly coherent in its geography, in its history, even in its culture, and in how all these things inform and perfectly mesh with the design of the game that takes place there, on the most intricate mechanical level. And all of these revelations are seeded so subtly through the course of the game that it takes an astute player to gather these dispersed motes of understanding and piece together the brilliance of the whole. I'd call myself a fan then, and I'd call myself a fan of Dark Souls 2 as well, even though it achieves almost none of those things. But what it does achieve is being a supremely confident game about third-person combat, with so many individual moments of brilliance that it is easily my favourite game of 2014, and it even, whisper it, makes some tweaks to Dark Souls under the bonnet operations that I rather appreciate, and in the simple introduction of more reliable multiplayer achieves experiences that its predecessor could not, particularly on PC, where the original's hopes for online functionality have been thoroughly mangled in Microsoft's heinous digital hellmouth known as Games for Windows Live. And yet, if you listen to certain subreddits, you'd think From Software had crimped off a stinking shitolata into every Dark Souls 2 jewel case. Some people hate it, and many are the explanations as to why, but behind the flame wars over stat tweaks and minute analysis of parry animations lurks a larger truth about Dark Souls 2's failings. Not always perceived by those who hate it, but disappointment certainly felt. It just doesn't have Now, usually I'm reluctant to apply auteur theory to games. They're huge projects whose ultimate creative direction is steered by the wrangling of collective talent, and yet sometimes an individual voice appears to have a momentous impact. Hidetaka Miyazaki may be one such voice, and his games, above and beyond the similarity of the action therein, share one trait of incredible value. They are coherent wholes. That doesn't sound like much, but consider how rare it is in games, a medium of iteration. Projects come together over years, pulling in little bits of learning from here and there, cobbling onto a single spine many different elements of play. Look at the way any big budget game from the major studios has repurposed bits of design from its other games. Any game from Warner Brothers now is likely to have Batman's procedurally animated combat. Any game from Ubisoft is likely to have parkour borrowed from Assassin's Creed, and any game from EA is going to use the Frostbite engine from now on, probably encouraging them to expand into open world settings. The economics of repurposing your design and technology investment elsewhere ends up dictating your future game's creative direction. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it leads to games which can feel compartmentalised or piecemeal or dissonant. The perennial example is how the Uncharted games clang together their narrative and combat in the vain hope they'll stick together somehow. But the warm and witty yarn about the adventures of lovable rogue Nathan Drake never sits easily with the fact he manages to kill more people than Idi Amin across the course of a 15-minute battle section.
Yeah, well, payback's a bitch.
But Miyazaki's games are not designed like this. They are complete things, in which every part is tied back to the thematic core of the game. Even abstract mechanical concepts like the idea of saving and loading are given meaning within the narrative world of these games. Dark Souls 2, however, was not a project Miyazaki helmed, and perhaps as a result it inherits systems and mechanics that it juggles and alters without realising that it's tearing apart the perfect coherence of the fiction Miyazaki had established. Miyazaki doesn't just come up with settings for his games, he comes up with a holistic economy, and then the rest of the fiction seems to spread out, tendril-like after the fact. And what I mean by that is that at the heart of Dark Souls, and of Miyazaki's later game Bloodborne, is a system of metaphysics, which is the cause of the way the entire world is organised. Its power structures, its history, its people and their purposes. In Dark Souls he asks, what would the world be like if the nature of sentience itself was a divisible but coalescing fuel? The game uses terms like souls and humanity, but they don't necessarily have the same meaning in Dark Souls' particular metaphysics as we might initially think. Here, souls are the essence of life, but they can also be consumed and amalgamated, split apart, bartered with and burnt. Humanity, too, the dark soul of the title, is a separate force in this world, but similarly malleable. If the soul animates you to life, then humanity gives you your independent will and purpose. In Bloodborne, blood itself is the commodity around which the world circles, and the society that emerges from it has the stench of the abattoir about it. Its culture is saturated with the idea of butchery and bleeding, of flesh and transfusion. And in both those games, though most coherently in Dark Souls, the very structure of the game is part of this economy. Who you are fighting, what you take from them, why they fear you, and what death means, what respawning after death means. Both these commodities, souls and humanity, inform your empowerment across the game in different ways. Consuming souls are the means by which you get stronger and faster and tougher, more alive, you might say. But it's humanity that allows you to become fully human, to call in other players, to help you in your world, to exert your will. Dark Souls pictures humanity and the soul as opposing forces. The soul, the gift of life, is a thing bestowed by the gods associated with light, while the spread of humanity, the spread of independent will, is accompanied by a creeping dark. And when humanity, which is to say human will and human desire, amasses in too great a quantity, this darkness becomes a consuming and destructive force. Without humanity, however, you become hollow, a mindless beast. And yet these rather clever allegories aren't thrust at you, but must be eked out, deduced from the logic of the way the game world operates. Some things are left purposefully unclear. At some point in the world's history, everyone simply stopped dying. Players and enemies alike are cursed to forever return from the grave, and various characters hint at completely different theories as to who is to blame for this. Is this curse brought upon the world by the darkness that is amassed humanity? So the gods would have you believe. Or is it a result of their misfiring experiment to rekindle their own power by burning humanity in bonfires? In either case, this metaphysics does not make its way intact into Dark Souls 2. Things are changed, partly out of convenience. No need to juggle two confusing resources, the game says. Humanity is reduced to an abstract concept, and all empowerment comes from souls, and hollowing is a result of their absence. Enemies now disappear permanently after you've clobbered them enough times, which I like from the perspective of making the game more widely accessible, but it rather undermines the point of them being eternally undead. And the final boss in the game, cackling like a megalomaniac, delivers a Bond villain-like speech in which she announces her plan to kill you. But obviously she can't, because you're undead, which she would know. It just isn't the coherent, complete vision that you get in Dark Souls, but an echo of it, partly misheard.
Be one with the dark.
The changes make the game easier, and I, for the sake of my sanity, do appreciate this. But I also recognise that part of the first game was about failure and punishment. Everyone and everything in the world has failed, and in its sometimes cruel difficulty, the game is goading you into giving up, to just allowing yourself in the game's lexicon to go hollow. The route is lined by the failures of previous adventurers on your very same quest. The size of their souls, a testament to how far they got before packing it in. The notion of difficulty in games is a thorny one for developers, particularly when the meaning of game derives from its challenge. Making Dark Souls accessible is a little bit like translating James Joyce's Ulysses into plain speech. More people may be able to read it, but you're kind of guiding them straight past the point. Lore in games is often just content. Fantasy lore is the worst, and every time a game promised me a deep and rich fiction, I begin to groan at the prospect of books upon books of sub-Tolkien drivel. Thus in the third age the great wizard Jizwon did smite the goblin lord Wankoff amid the ruins the great kingdoms of Spath, and oh god, what's that trembling? Is that in Tolkien's entire burial site rotating? This stuff often serves no great purpose, it's just there. Dark Souls though, now that is something else. As well as contemplating the nature of sentience and humanity and so on, it's also a mythic adventure about the nature of myth itself, about how myths are told and retold, how their meanings shift to support particular ideas or agendas. Dark Souls uses this to show the attentive player that the hero's journey, the very story arc you're embarking on, may be a fabrication, designed to lead you to fulfill somebody else's plan, an agenda that involves the assassination of a king. This is exactly the way that the myth of King Arthur operates throughout history. It's obvious to say that there are many parallels and references to Arthurian myth in Dark Souls. It too is set in a medieval world of dragons, knights and quests, but Dark Souls isn't just appropriating the trappings of Arthurian myth, it's showing you how myths themselves can be used to incredibly political and dangerous ends. This is particularly true of the way Arthurian myth is used to discuss divine predestination. The logic of it goes like this. God is omnipotent. Nothing is beyond his knowledge. He knows the past, and he knows the future. If you roll a die, he knows what number it will land on. So, in a world of divine predestination, if someone accrues power, God must have foreseen it and ordained it so. Thus, the ultimate power on earth, the power of kings, is divine in its origin. But the divine right to rule as king becomes more complicated when that king is killed or overthrown. Is it going against God's will to plot the downfall of a king? Or does the usurper, by virtue of his success, prove God's favour? And what could cause a king to deserve usurpation or assassination? The central text of Arthurian legend tells us of both his rise and fall as king, and inevitably it addresses this very paradox. And so does every subsequent retelling, each serving the spirit of a different time and written for a different court of nobles, who might have very different ideas of how right it was to overthrow a bad king. This is perhaps why Arthur looks decidedly unheroic in many retellings of the story. He becomes what academics call the do-nothing king, a man who sits behind his walls and sends knights out on quixotic missions, and his inaction ultimately loses him his wife, the realm, and his life. The writers of such stories weren't inheriting the myth, but modifying it, lending credibility to their new royal patron's position as perhaps a just usurper of a denigrated crown. The story of Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the most elegant pieces of political writing, sponsored, it is thought, by John of Gaunt during the reign of Richard II. It portrays Arthur's rule as obsessed with and paralysed by courtly etiquette, an accusation that many levelled at Richard II himself. The Green Knight entraps Sir Gawain in a game which exploits these very rules, mocking and exposing their weaknesses. And in Dark Souls, you're encouraged to overthrow not just a king, but the king of gods, the do-nothing king, the failure, Gwyn, who has lost his realm and his mind. It is predestined, you're told, your allotted fate. And yet Dark Souls knows how myth is used to manipulate for political end. At every point you're being spun by the characters who purport to chaperone you to your destiny, and the delivery mechanism for their agenda is myth. Not all the myths one encounters in Dark Souls are there to deceive the player, however. The legend of Artorias, supposedly a great long-dead saviour of the land, is perhaps intended to give hope to the other denizens of the world. After finding out what's left of him, corrupted and broken by the abyssal terror he is said to have thwarted, the player can only conclude that Artorias is a failure, and his legend is a fabrication. It should be the hint players need to question the other information they're given about their own quest. But even with all the facts to hand, Dark Souls provides no precise interpretation. Myth is murky and multi-purpose, a patchwork of so many other sources, philosophies and agendas, not to mention misinterpretations and transcription errors. Nonetheless, it's possible to posit, with a cynicism inherited from knowledge of how Arthurian myth operates, that there is no fixed destiny for the player, that he's not special, that these are in fact myths delivered to support a particular agenda. The player is but one of many sent out on this voyage, and he or she has been manipulated by some who want to usher in an age of dark, and by others who want to encourage the player to sacrifice themselves to keep the world's light alive a little longer. Forgive the hyperbole, but I think this is about as brilliant an examination of how myth operates as exists in any medium, by allowing the player to be ensnared by it. And it is, furthermore, a masterful overturning of the egocentric hero's journey as it is expressed particularly through video games, which so often flatter the agency of the player. There is, needless to say, nothing really so sophisticated happening in Dark Souls 2. There's still plenty to enjoy. There are smaller, self-enclosed stories here and there that are cut above other fantasy fiction, and unravelled in the same investigatory, deductive manner through disparate item descriptions, the rumours and mutterings of characters, and other little clues dotted around the world. But there is no grand coherence to the overall narrative journey, and your purpose in fulfilling your quest seems to dematerialise upon completion of the game. There's certainly no revelation to be had here about the nature of story itself, even if Dark Souls 2 does a lot to further the Arthurian themes of its predecessor. It is much more explicit, for example, in its discussion of the nature of fate, which I will now bang on about. Chance, adventure, grace, fortune and fate, to the medieval mind, these are all reflections of the same idea. Since everything that happens is foreseen and permitted by God, and since God is good, what he ordains must be just. People therefore deserve their fates. Good fortune is an expression not of luck as statisticians today might understand it, but a big thumbs up from the Almighty. Indeed, the words luck and chance do not have the same sense of randomness that we might attribute to them today. Instead, to expose yourself to chance, or as they say in the period, to take the adventure, is to willingly prostrate yourself before God, to test your innate character and accept God's verdict. Knights go out on quests not specifically to do good deeds, but to discover their own goodness or otherwise. This is why so often, as with Spider-Man and Harry Potter, the young quester belatedly discovers that they come from noble parentage all along, a crude earthly corroboration of the divine favour that was always allotted to them because of their innate goodness. Fate, free will and the power of God, these are things over which people argue, kill and die with great enthusiasm during the medieval period and beyond. No wonder then that the Arthurian narrative, which so totally encapsulates the problem, becomes such an indelible trope, informing everything from video games to the very ideas that shape our movement through the modern world. Consider how recently, in Gold Rush era USA for example, young men would set out to seek their fortune, or how often conquest has been couched in terms of self-justifying God-given power. Secularists may be more sober about their place in the world today, but that sense of destiny has permanently stained our language and thus our thought, helped in no small way by our inherent egocentrism and Western prosperity. Dark Souls 2 actually engages with this directly. It continually questions what goodness even is in a world which seemingly operates under divine predestination. One murderous character who you discover locked up in a magical cage goes as far as to excuse his actions by saying,
I'm only using what the gods gave me. How can that be so wrong?
The game shows some literary nous in taking this issue on, but its conclusion about this, about whether or not you're fated, whether or not you have free will, whether or not you're good, seems to be a shrug of the shoulders, and then the titles roll. In Dark Souls you could be sure that every item description, every fragment of evidence, even if it was misleading, built towards a coherent reality, albeit one that might never be fully revealed. And there's none of that trust in Dark Souls 2. Its world is too much of a jumble, too stitched together from mismatched pieces to truly convince you that its fiction has meaning. And it's a lack of continuity and coherence that is demonstrated equally in the very landscape of the world itself. One of the most obvious triumphs of Dark Souls is the incredible feat of designing its densely interlinked geography, cities upon cities entwining a giant tree, each connected by a web of hidden paths that are unlocked over time, making traversal between previously distant areas easier. Dark Souls 2 has none of that. Its world stretches out along linear spokes and often has jarring transitions that put the lie to the notion that this is a single world. Travel up an elevator and you'll pop out in the centre of a volcano. And in Dark Souls, where you find enemies is a critical clue to the meaning of the world. You might ask, why would one of Gwyn's knights be in here of all places and begin to juice his purpose? But this seems to be less important in Dark Souls 2, to the extent that the recent special edition of the game, titled Scholar of the First Sin, remixes the enemy placement altogether for the sake of variety. But the reason that this is an interesting failure is that such problems occur as a result of a troubled development, and it's rare to see such deep scars in a game which nonetheless survives to be pretty damn great. Buried in Dark Souls 2 is an entirely different game altogether, one which uses illumination and shadow as a central mechanic, forcing you to ignite beacons just to see the way. This design now survives in only a couple of areas of the game, and interviews with the developers suggest the entire project was given an abrupt and comprehensive overhaul midway through development. Under intense time constraints, the team was unable to turf out the work they had already completed on the aborted design, and instead were forced to repurpose it, finding new use for characters and welding together entirely distinct landscapes into a new world map. The disjoints that result can be felt keenly, but it's entirely testament to the tremendous skill of the team that the game even shipped, let alone that it manages to be as great a game as it is, better than any other game that year to my mind. Its flaws are really only flaws when held against the blinding brilliance of its predecessor, and to reassemble the shards of a broken project into anything that might reflect that earlier game, even imperfectly, is only just short of miraculous. And what can we expect of Dark Souls 3, announced recently with Miyazaki back at the helm? What neat meta-narrative meaning can be squeezed from the third game in a trilogy without retreading the same ground? It's dangerous to hope for a further miracle, but if anyone can keep the flame alive, it's Miyazaki. As Dark Souls' beloved character Solaire might observe, if only we could be so grossly incandescent.